So thanks so much for those of you who were able to stay. We have our final session for the day, which is a provocation by Sharon Stein from the University of British Columbia. And her title is Beyond Sustainability, Repurposing the University in Times of Ecological Crisis. And Sharon is a long-time collaborator with our university, especially Crit. So it's really great to have her here again to share her very critical work on the university. Yeah, and just so you know, while it is late in the afternoon for us, it is very early in the morning for her. So also thank you, Sharon, for making those concessions and getting up early in the morning to come speak to us. So thanks very much. I'll hand over to you online, hopefully.
Thanks, Jenny. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. You're good.
Okay. So good afternoon. Good morning for me. Sorry about the slight delay. We got the time zones a little bit mixed, but we're all good now. So thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. Really appreciate my long-time collaborations with you all. I'm just going to start by acknowledging the territory that I'm speaking to you from, which is the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations in what is currently known as Vancouver, Canada. And if you've been following conversations about decolonization in North America, then you might have noticed acknowledgements like these. Sometimes these acknowledgements can become tokenistic and treat colonialism as if it's sort of a settled event. And what I like to do in these moments is just, acknowledge that it's not. It's very much an ongoing thing. It's very much related to questions of unsustainability, and it's very much related to my talk today. And of course, there's also colonialism that allows this talk to happen too, right? Including, the rare earth minerals that go into the computers that allow us to connect and that are mined under very unethical and ecologically destructive conditions. The carbon that's created from the data centers that allow us also to connect. And essentially, colonialism is everywhere and everywhere connected to unsustainability. And that's kind of the premise of my work and also my talk today. And also just to say that these acknowledgements we make, at least for me, not to blame or shame anyone, but rather to remind us of our responsibility to try and figure out how to live together differently in less destructive ways. So the question of sustainability and why it matters to our universities, people have different answers. But for my talk today, the way I'm going to be approaching sustainability, which is questioning kind of sustainability, what are we sustaining, in whose name, for whose benefit, and at whose expense? And I asked this question because of some questions that are orienting my work these days and the work of my research collective gesturing towards decolonial futures. And these questions are, what if you knew in your bones, not just in your mind, that major social and ecological breakdown is inevitably on the horizon, and that in 10 or 20 years or less, what is familiar today will no longer be viable? What would we be doing or advocating for in our universities if we knew this was the case? And when the children born today look back 30 years from now, what actions would they be grateful that we took? So when we think about the questions that are orienting most sustainability efforts at universities, I would say they're pretty mainstream. Universities are understood to have a unique role in catalyzing climate action. They might approach this somewhat differently, but this usually looks like greening campus operations, encouraging recycling, supporting climate research, and also embracing the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So thinking about the limitations of this approach, which we might call business as usual, but greener, is something that I'm going to spend a little bit of time doing, although you might all be very familiar with these limitations. But only one of the SDGs really addresses the importance of higher education, but some have kind of envisioned universities as being a place to address all of the SDGs and kind of frame this as a natural outgrowth of universities' roles in society. And of course, we saw the creation of the Times Higher Education Impact Ratings, which supposedly addresses universities, the extent to which universities address the SDGs. But many critiques increasingly, over the years of the SDGs point out how they are really in many ways oriented toward continuity of the same Eurocentric paradigms of progress, development, and innovation that underlie our very unsustainable system. So ultimately, they don't really support sustainability. So this dominant paradigms of sustainability presumes that we can continue producing economic growth in the way that we have for many hundreds of years and balance people, planet, and profit. So this assumption essentially that we can decouple economic growth from environmental degradation, which leads then to this idea of sustainability as business as usual, but greener. And one way of thinking about this is that it's based in a desire to transcend the unsustainability of our current system without giving anything up. So, particularly those of us in the global north who have contributed the most carbon emissions over time want to find a way to continue our current levels of consumption and not have to change anything about our way of life, even if that means sacrificing or continuing to sacrifice other communities and landscapes. Now, critical sustainability efforts draw attention to what they view as the false promises of mainstream sustainability, things like the SDGs, and specifically the risk that these efforts will reproduce unequal and extractive and paternalistic patterns of relationship between systemically marginalized and systemically dominant communities, that they will seek out simplistic solutions to complex problems, and that they will naturalize Eurocentric imaginaries of justice, responsibility, and change in their pursuit of mainstream sustainability. So a more critical approach, something that looks at either a more critical form of sustainability or that looks entirely beyond sustainability, really understands colonialism and capitalism as the root causes and drivers of climate change and biodiversity loss, and emphasizes the imperative of redistribution and reparations in our sustainability responses, drawing attention to the fact that the communities that contributed the least to the climate and nature emergency are the communities most heavily impacted by it and who have the fewest material resources to respond. So I'm just going to briefly review, some of the critiques offered by these critical sustainability approaches. So the first is that most mainstream sustainability efforts really act as a form of institutional greenwashing. Basically, our universities are presenting themselves as environmentally friendly, but we continue to reproduce through our research, through our education, the same unsustainable colonial system. Second is the notion that mainstream sustainability is grounded in and reproduces a Eurocentric politics of knowledge when it comes to the creation and dissemination of knowledge about climate and nature, and really in particular favoring Western science as the end-all be-all of knowledge about this and ignoring other knowledges, in particular indigenous and other non-Western knowledges. Third is kind of building on the critique of the Eurocentric politics of knowledge, emphasizing, challenging the emphasis on, framing the climate and nature emergency as a technical problem that can be solved with more innovation, which then ignores, the relational, the cultural, the systemic dimensions of climate change and ignores, in particular, the role of colonialism and capitalism in climate change. . 4th is a challenge to the assumption that, the only way to proceed is with growth-based economies, and the only form of development or the only desired path forward is Western development, despite the fact that these ways forward require the reproduction and expansion of extractive and exploitative systems. And then the last critique is that, these dynamics tend to lead to the reproduction of paternalistic solutions, quote unquote, being imposed, particularly by the global north onto the global south, or by non-Indigenous communities onto Indigenous communities. And these solutions don't just not generally benefit those communities, but they often benefit the systemically dominant partner in that relationship. So these are often called then false solutions. That benefit wealthier communities and don't address the underlying ecological issues. So examples of this would be something like carbon trading that results in the dispossession of indigenous land, or again, this, mining of rare earth minerals that allow us to have electric cars in the global north that pollute the communities of where these things are mined. So in sum, the kind of critical analysis of mainstream sustainability is this notion from one of my collaborators, Chief Binawahne Kui, who says the colonial ways of organizing, thinking, feeling, relating, hoping, imagining, and being that have got us into this situation alone cannot get us out of it. So what else might we do? What I'm going to talk for the rest of my time about is this notion of potentially repurposing the university that we have inherited, the university that wants mainstream sustainability, for which critical sustainability is not really legible or intelligible, that says it's probably very difficult to repurpose the university, but also if we don't do that, then we're going to be increasingly irrelevant in a very quickly changing climate impacted world. So if we examine the past and present of the university, we might conclude that it has very little to offer a world in crisis. But we also have a lot of resources still flowing in and held in our institutions. And it may be that this current crisis offers up an opportunity to repurpose the outdated role of the university for more relevance and more responsibility in a climate affected world through practices, in particular, of redistribution, reparation, restitution, and regeneration. In particular, the reallocation of power and resources with due consideration of systemic and ongoing power inequalities, repaying debts to the communities that have been negatively impacted by dominant institutions through slavery and colonialism in particular. And not just material repair, right, but also epistemic repair, relational repair, alongside these more financial forms of reparations. And this would require not just the repair of relationships with those communities, but also the transformation of the communities on the other side, an interruption of the ongoing colonial desires, colonial knowledge production on the side of those who have produced the most harm. So there's sort of a two-pronged effort in repurposing the university, addressing the harm done and essentially interrupting the harm done and reframing, what we might do in our institutions. So I'm just going to share two examples of efforts to repurpose the university, neither of which are models for what we might do, but just imperfect examples that show the possibilities. So the first one is what was the UBC Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies Climate and Nature Emergency Catalyst Program. So this was held at my institution about 2 years ago, right before this institute actually closed in its current form. And I think the timing was not a coincidence. Essentially, we probably wouldn't have been able to do this experiment that we did if the institute was going to be around. But because it was closing, they were less concerned about what we were doing that last year. And this is a very traditionally elitist corner of the university. Usually they would just fund scholars for a year to do whatever kind of work they want. And we said, well, this kind of reproduces the, ivory tower mode of academia. What else could we do besides celebrate individual scholarly genius in order to make this program more relevant? So we said, how could we create a program that addresses the climate and nature emergency that focuses on redistribution and reparations? So rather than centering individual scholars, what we did was try to create opportunities for collaborative, critically engaged approaches to knowledge creation and dissemination and multi-generational engagements. So we created 6 cohorts of faculty, undergrad and graduate students, artists, emeriti professors, and staff. And rather than frame the climate and nature emergency as a technical problem, we framed it as something with roots in colonialism and capitalism and consumption. We didn't tell everybody that this was the only way to approach it, but we invited them continuously throughout the program to look at climate change through that lens. And all the participants were invited to be self-reflexive and think about themselves as autonomous, yes, but that they were always invited back into this collective inquiry about approaching climate change differently. And we actually oriented this around 4 guiding principles. So one was the principle of ethical collaboration. So we had some funding for people to do projects, but these projects should be transdisciplinary, intergenerational, and community engaged, and ideally based in trust, respect, reciprocity, consent, and accountability. 2 was about the intellectual depth of the approach, and in particular, trying to look at intellectual depth through multiple knowledge systems, but also through self-reflexivity about their own approach that people were taking, trying to interrupt these usual patterns of engagement. 3 was reparative redistribution. So trying to allocate resources in ways that prioritize the populations most affected by the climate and nature emergency, and areas of research that addressed the most urgent impacts as well. And then finally, engagement with our institutional Indigenous strategic plan so that the participants would deepen their understanding of settler responsibilities if they were not Indigenous, and focused on supporting the aspirations of Indigenous scholars and communities. So we spent the year trying to invite people to continuously engage these principles. We use these principles to address when we were doing funding decisions. And it wasn't easy trying to repurpose the university in this way. So we found that ethical collaborations were very difficult for people to orient themselves toward. Many projects that they had proposed never really got off the ground because they didn't realize how much relational work was required in order for that to happen. The approach to intellectual depth that we took, that was not the usual sort of elitist ivory tower approach, was also a challenge for people. It was definitely not yet common sense. Reparative redistribution, also not common sense. People understood this in very different ways, and some people took issue with it, whereas other people said we weren't taking it far enough. And then engagement with the Indigenous strategic plan requires a lot more flexibility than people realized. So we don't view the fact that these things were difficult as a problem. We have a strong orientation toward learning from difficulty and failure, but trying to understand where institutions are really at to see if it's even possible to repurpose them in this way. And we created a report that is called Moving with Storms that's about this process, where you can learn from our learning so that if others are doing similar experiments, they can benefit from that. So the second and last example of repurposing the university for ecological crisis is the example of the University of the Forest. So the University of the Forest is a centuries-old, essentially indigenous university in the Amazon in Brazil. So it's one of our community partners, the Hunikui people. They say, when we started working with them, like, we also have our university. Our university is the forest, and the president of our university is the Samauma tree, which is this enormous tree in the Amazon. And so the physical campus of the University of the Forest is in the state of Acre in Brazil, and it's governed by the customary laws of the community. emphasizing reciprocity and accountability to the forest and all of its inhabitants. And that's where young people from the community learn that they don't just care for the Amazon biome, that they are also part of it. Although the University of the Forest has served the Hunikui people for centuries, in our ongoing collaborations with the communities, they decided to say that we see the urgent crisis happening in the world. And these aren't just local emergencies affecting the Amazon, but they're affecting everybody to differing degrees. And what they decided to do was say, we would like to offer educational aid to Western institutions. So they flipped the usual colonial script where Western institutions are offering aid to non-Western communities and said, we actually have a lot to teach the West, and we would like to create a digital or virtual campus of the University of the Forest that's tailored to the re-education of Western students, essentially, so that they also remember that they are not just responsible to the land, but part of it. So they decided they want to create this platform of curricula for people in the West in collaboration with our research collective, and figuring out how we can use the universities in the West as a space to bring the University of the Forest digital campus to life. So the University of the Forest has 5 faculties: faculty of respect, faculty of reverence, faculty of responsibility, faculty of reciprocity, faculty of regeneration. So very different kind of terminology and focus than, the faculties that we have in Western or Westernized universities. And he said, our collaborator, Chief Nunawa, who I mentioned before, who is the sort of international representative of University of the Forest, he says that although the community would like to offer its education to others, or this collaboration with others, what would be required first is for Western institutions and Western academics to shed our arrogance and commit to material, epistemic, and relational repair for all of the harm that we and our institutions have done. It's like that's a requirement for respectful relationships with the community. So this could entail, redistributing funds to their university to support the, in-person University of the Forest for the community. It could look like building partnerships between Western researchers and community, and that's focused on the priorities of the community itself, and also developing educational experiences for Western students that invite them to interrupt modern patterns of extraction and consumption and deepen their accountabilities to Indigenous peoples and to the rights of nature. So there's a lot of work, essentially, that would be required in order for collaborations like this to really thrive and not become the usual extractive mode of relationship. And there's a lot of interruption of colonial habits of being that would be required on the Western side. And I'm not sure it's possible, but I think it's worth trying, because if the alternative is mainstream sustainability, then I think we are better off trying something different, even if that leads to failure and hopefully more learning. So I'm just going to kind of close with an example of something from the University of the Forest Digital Campus, which is an acronym that was developed between them and my research collective, and it's called Climate Fraud. And it's essentially an analytical framework that can be used to critically assess the climate solutions that are proposed by university researchers or by policymakers. And essentially, the community wanted to develop this in order to identify false solutions to the climate and nature emergency. So we have, carbon colonialism, the appropriation of land and resources in the global south to fulfill the carbon dioxide reduction demands from the global north. We have land grabbing that's used for green energy projects, for instance, that become green sacrifice zones. Indigenous co-optation, so the strategic mobilization of certain Indigenous communities or individuals that corporations or governments use to say, look, Indigenous people all approve this because this one person said that it was okay. Mandatory growth in consumerism, again, this notion that we have no other option but to continue with infinite growth on a finite planet. Absurd promises of carbon sequestration as a solution, toxic hope in and desire for the continuity of our current system that's violent and unsustainable. Externalization of costs, in particular, thinking about things like green technology, green energy, and carbon trading. Financialization of nature, which carbon trading is a great example of. Regulatory loopholes that are exploited in responses to the climate crisis. Arrogant techno-solutionism, the idea that technology will solve all our problems. Ubiquitous greenwashing, and distorted narratives and deceptive claims. So this is the kind of educational tools and frameworks that are offered by University of the Forest. And lastly, I'll just share, that they have developed several resources, and one of these, which is really quite interesting for people in my context to consider, is a pledge of generations. So essentially what we owe the generations that came before us and the generations that came after us. And I won't review the pledge in detail, but I will say that it's a really strong emphasis of the University of the Forest to invite a sense of intergenerational and interspecies responsibility, which is another thing that mainstream sustainability says that it's doing sometimes. But if you look at the actions of our institutions following mainstream sustainability efforts, it doesn't really feel like we feel our accountability to future generations. And that goes back to my opening question about what would young people born today say about what we're doing now 30 years from now. Like, what can we do to actually fulfill our responsibilities to those young people? And I would say, at least when I look around at my institution, I don't think we are fulfilling those responsibilities. And I think if they look back on what we're doing, they'd probably be pretty disappointed in us. So that to me is a call to responsibility and a call to at least try to do something different, and repurposing the university in these ways with these very small, examples is my way of trying to respond to that call. And I think I will end it there. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Sharon. I actually forgot I was facilitating for a second. Okay, so I'll now open the floor to any questions or comments, both online so if you're online, and you can pop your messages in the chat. If you're in person, please raise a hand. Okay, we've got Cliff, that's one. And Bruce, that's two. Okay.
Okay, thanks, colleagues. Thanks so much, Sharon, for that wonderful presentation. I'm quite interested in the synergy and how we communicate with the environment. It reminds me of yesterday, we were engaging with some of our colleagues from engineering, doing brilliant work, and then they were explaining how they had to do a cooling system for the fish tanks because the fishes needed a certain level of temperature. And I was like, who interviewed the fishes? Like, I'm interested to see which fish told us that a certain level of temperature is ideal for them. And I'm quite fascinated by the University of the Forest. I see on the website the longest serving president of the university is the sacred Samauma tree. And even the senior leadership is such a wonderful synergy between humans and non-human entities in society. And oftentimes we do not speak enough about the non-human entities and the environment, which is such an important part. So if you can open my mind to how this engagement happens, because we humans in this room, and I have an understanding of how we engage in. But how do I engage with the sacred Samauma tree? How do I engage with the non-human entities as we repurpose this university that you're envisioning? Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bruce, Sharon, and thanks so much for. So my first question was, I want to learn how to do presentations like you. It was quite fascinating to see what you do. And then the second one is the question around the whole notion of repurposing of the university. And I'm thinking through a local contextual lens, a lens that suggests that we are faced with historical and contemporary types of challenges in rethinking on repurposing, because based on some of the interactions we've been having during the day, some of our community members, or the majority of the populace of this country, daily survival is still an issue. And so thinking beyond planetary sustainability, although we know they are interconnected, people's mode is how do we survive every day? And so sometimes I think there is a growing disconnect between the intellectual discourses, on whatever side of the continuum, whether it be progressive or conservative, around the daily needs. One of our participants from the community reminded us today, because the first thing our communities ask, what is there in it for us? We have been tired being lectured, and now you come in with a new lecture on sustainability, which makes the work of some of us quite complex in trying to make meaningful change in addressing historical balances. So would you think that the repurposing in the global north and global south, and I'm talking about the architectures of university, should that look the same? Should our discourses be different as well? Mindful that I don't think you're making a small impact. I think the one consolation I give myself is that I won't be able to change anything in my lifetime, but I know we can make a meaningful impact. As your one question say, 30 years from now, what will the question be about us around this table that sat here? But do you think we could have the same type of change? Because sometimes you get a sense that people are co-opted in positions, and then it just becomes a talk. And then where the change really needs to be felt, it's not felt by people. And then you sit with that tension about the perception of the university. So even convincing people that the university can play a meaningful role in changing their lives, their lived lives, versus changing the lives of the environment becomes quite a complex thing to navigate in South Africa. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Cliff and Bruce. I'm going to hand over to Sharon now, but I just wanted to highlight the questions in the chat for those who are in the room. So we have John Barry from Ireland who's asking, is there a role for unlearning in what you are proposing, exnovation as well as innovation? And if so, what is that we in the global north in particular? Is it that we in the global north in particular need to unlearn? And then we have Emmanuel. He's asking, sorry, I think I've confused him. So his question is, should the repurposing of the university be a global agenda? And if it should become a global agenda, how will the repurposing lead to the development of underdeveloped and developing nations? So thanks, Sharon.
Thank you all so much for those excellent questions. So I won't go in order because I think it's important to respond to the question about context. And it's something I usually emphasize more at the beginning of my talk. So sorry, I was a bit flustered, but definitely I never speak in universals. I'm only speaking from my context. My context is very much a North American context, and thinking about what worked or doesn't work here, rather than trying to suggest that people elsewhere do anything similar to what we're doing. Because this work, in order for it to be relevant, has to be contextually based. And what we actually need is the interruption of this universalization of approaches, which doesn't mean we can't learn from each other, right? I remember the first time I came to South Africa, I was so nervous and I was like, Andre, I don't think like anything I have to say is relevant here. And he's like, it's not that, it's going to be like, okay, you do the same thing here or anything else, but we can actually learn by talking to each other across these very different contexts, as long as we recognize that we're coming from our own perspectives and angles and priorities. And I think that the question about communities' daily needs, or the sense of what's in it for us, is a very relevant question. And I would say if we assess the current state of, I'll just speak for the universities here, that there isn't often much in it for people. And I think that would be, an orienting question about repurposing the university is, how can it be more relevant for people's lives? Perhaps not always in a direct daily way, but in a bigger picture, certainly. And when I work with communities, I often emphasize that I don't know if the university can play a meaningful role. Like, I'm super honest about it. Like, they know the colonial history and present of the university. I know it. So when we're trying to, redistribute resources from the universities to communities, for instance, we know that at some point that might not be possible, and there might be something that interrupts that. We know that it's an experiment, and that there's a lot to be learned from that experiment. But because of the trust we have built, we know that we're trying to do that together. So I think being really honest about the limitations of the university, and then asking communities, given these limitations, given this history, do you still want to try doing something together? And sometimes the answer will be no, and that, then we have to respect that as well. So the question of how we learn to listen to other than human beings is such an important question. I'm rephrasing it slightly, but I hope I'm honoring the question. And it's one of the questions that I sit with all the time because one of the reasons I think we're in this climate and nature emergency is because we forgot how to relate to other than human beings as beings with agency and imagination, rather than objects or property for us to own and control. Now, how we get from where we are to a place where we're in genuine relationship and genuine communication with these other than human beings is a big question mark. The indigenous communities that I work with have their own ways, but certainly it's not about appropriating those ways and bringing them to the global north. And that's not what they're asking us to do, for instance, with the University of the Forest. They're saying, you all need to find some way to reconnect or remember that you're already connected to the rest of nature, that humans are not separated from nature. And actually, they think that's the very root of not just unsustainability, but colonialism itself, they say, is this sense of separation between humans and earth and humans and each other. Because if we didn't see ourselves as separate from nature or from each other, then we wouldn't be able to rationalize exploiting and extracting from each other. So we do have, certain exercises that we've developed with the University of the Forest. We have these forest walks, for instance, that invite people to relate to the land differently. And the kind of way we've decided to frame it in collaboration and conversation with the Hunikui community is that these walks are inspired by sort of indigenous relational ontologies, but that they're not the ontologies themselves, because it doesn't make sense to bring it from their context to ours, and it would be appropriative and extractive. So they're sort of like, we want to share the way we approach things, but you all have to figure out how to do it yourself differently. And it's not easy, although often when I ask people, do you have a moment that you remember where it did feel like the forest might have been speaking to you, even in a language that you didn't understand? Many people say yes, and they have these experiences that showed them there's something else, but that our Western education system has told them to edit out. So it's about unnumbing, really, to our sense of connection to other than human beings. And we're kind of just in the very beginning stages of seeing what that means and how we can do it responsibly. So super important question, but I don't think we can get out of or navigate this mess if we don't ask it. So the role of unlearning, yes, I think it's like at least 50% of this is unlearning, and then 50% of it would be learning. And specifically, if I think about my context in the global north, that is about unlearning colonial habits of knowing, being, thinking, and feeling. The way we relate to the world, the way we relate to each other, we relate to nature. There's many habits and perceived entitlements that we are socialized into in the global north to protect unrestricted autonomy, to have moral and epistemic authority, to be affirmed in the self-image that we have of ourselves. And we want a sense of certainty, control, and continuity. All of these things have a huge price that we displace onto other people and other than human beings. So there's a lot of things to sort of unlearn and interrupt. And then there's the other side of, okay, we're unlearning these things. What do we need to learn or relearn that we have forgotten? For instance, how to communicate with other than human beings. Usually the learning part is more appealing to people than the unlearning, because the unlearning requires us to give up something that is currently giving us satisfaction. And so it's a kind of a hard sell to offer this sense of unlearning unless people already have a really strong sense that this system isn't working, in which case they're willing to try doing the unlearning because they feel like there's no other option. And it's very possible we'll only get to the unlearning or the possibility of the unlearning once this existing system is more clearly not sustainable for more people. And although some of us might feel that this is already very clear, I think for some people, they know in some level, but they're still in denial in another. And so we will work with the people who are ready for that unlearning and learning now, and then try and prepare for the deluge of people that might be coming as the comforts and securities we have traditionally enjoyed in the global north become eroded from climate change. Then the question of whether repurposing should be a global agenda. This goes back to my first response, which is there's no universals here. If people find the concept useful, then by all means. But I'm very wary of any kind of like global agenda, because that usually becomes a guise for more colonialism. So again, we can learn from each other across our different contexts, but proposing a universal solution is not something that I'm trying to do.
Thanks so much, Sharon. Let me just see what our time looks like. Okay, are there any burning questions in the room? If not, then I'm going to just share the last few comments in the chat and then ask Sharon to just respond to that. So we have John Barry, who just says, thank you for the answer, Sharon. Decolonization also means decolonizing our imaginaries and official/inherited ways of thinking and acting. Latifat says there is no moving forward without looking backward and inward. The need to keep dismantling the barriers and discrimination that perpetuates the educational system. And also says the decolonization of knowledge systems is pertinent. And then we have Nyaradzo, who says, referring to the guiding principle of ethical collaborations, please share your thoughts on how to best navigate the ethical challenges in a way that does not undermine the goals or relevance of engagement programs and projects. Okay, so then Sharon, if I can just ask you to respond to that and any closing remarks, and then we will wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you. So yes, definitely agree, decolonization of knowledge. And one of the ways that we think about this is that, usually in the colonial context, we have this search for universal relevance. And we think knowledge has to be universal for it to be relevant. And we generally claim that Western science is universal. And then we've also got the kind of postmodern shift in the other direction, which is like, oh, absolute relativism, everything is equal, everything's all the same, like, blah. So what would be something in between that, which would be contextual relevance, which is that all knowledge systems have contextual relevance. They're not universally relevant. So for instance, I would like a engineer to build my plane if I'm going to fly on a plane. But if I'm trying to build relationships, I might need a different knowledge system than the engineering. No offense to engineers at all. Some of them are lovely people, but that's not the strength of their knowledge system, right? So I think it's not about, often when we critique the Eurocentrism of Western knowledge, people think that means we're totally trashing everything and throwing away science, which is not the case. It's rather that bringing science down to a level where we see it as equal with indigenous knowledge systems, with other non-scientific Western knowledge systems for that matter. And often that demotion feels like a trashing, but actually it's just how could we have this equity in ecology of knowledge. So yes, super important for repurposing the university is decolonizing knowledge. The question of the ethical collaborations, I'm not entirely sure I'm understanding the question, but if the idea is that these ethical challenges can get in the way of the project, then I think that's okay, in the sense of, like, the goal for me is never to make sure this project happens. It's to have the quality of relationships. And prioritizing the quality of relationships and the quality of our collective learning is also a repurposing of the university, because usually we have these very clear ideas of what we want to do with the project before we even start. And then we go to the community with that already in mind, instead of asking the community what their priority is. And so I think it's actually about trying to interrupt this desire that we usually have, or that is imposed on us by the university, that we have to prove outcomes and that we have to know them in advance, as opposed to letting these things evolve, as opposed to treating it as a process that has its own integrity. Yeah, I don't know if that's, yeah. So I think if unless there's other questions, yes, John Barry is saying that equality for those who are systemically dominant always feels like a loss. That's a very apt observation. Indeed, it does feel like a loss for people who have had systemic power. And I don't know if there's a way around that, except to remind them that they're also missing out on a lot by embracing their privileges, in addition to causing a lot of harm. So I think that's it, unless there's any other questions.
I think there are some hands on Zoom, but I'm afraid we're running out of time to take them. So sorry about that. I do think the people with hands did manage to give some input in the chat. So I think just to say, firstly, thank you so much, Sharon, for joining us, especially so early in the morning. I think we thought you are 9 hours behind us, but you are 10 hours? Is that what the mistake was?
We have a, we turned the clocks back in the fall, and I think when we made the time, we forgot that. And I even remembered last night, but then for some reason my alarm didn't go off. So anyway, we made it, and I'm sorry for being late.
No problem at all. So thank you very much, and thank you to everyone who made it today, both online and in person, for your inputs, your contributions in various ways. We will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. South African Standard Time, which is 2 GMT plus 2 or UCT plus 2 or something like that. So for those who are not in our time zones. But the program is still the same. So if you have an updated program, you are on the right track. Let me close here. I don't think you need to listen to me talk any longer, and I'm sure everyone wants to get home for supper. Thanks so much. Bye.